Chorel Competentsue Chore Chushoso Kamsanida Aporodo Hamke Ilhagu Shipsumnida. I give a lot of presentations, and when you give presentations, you want people to talk about your presentations afterwards, but nobody can pronounce my name. So I wrote it in Korean. So Ciarán O'Riordan. I work for Eclipse Foundation. I've been working on policy for free software for 20 years in Brussels. In this talk, I'm going to try to get through 4 topics. So digital sovereignty, why the Cyber Resilience Act is a big change, how we can change and be very successful, and coordination between countries and how to keep it simple. So the first thing is that the international context has changed, and some people say that this is because different people and different governments got elected, but I don't think that's the real reason. I think the context has changed because governments have started to realize just how much we depend on technology and how much we depend on supply chains. And so Jeep, the car company, had a bad day a few months ago. They sent out a software update for their cars, and their cars were no longer able to operate. I think this made it clear that when people are wondering if a piece of software can be harmed or can stop to operate because of a service provider, well, the answer is yes, because if it can happen accidentally, it can happen for other reasons. So we're starting to realize how much we depend on software updates, including security updates, on service providers who operate these services, on service providers who might verify or adapt our software to our needs, and we rely on permission sometimes to be able to expand a program or to commercialize software that we're using. And so this is causing governments to talk about the services that they need to provide. So governments are starting to make lists of the essential online services that their citizens expect and rely on. Then they look at a list of software packages that provide these services. And then the third thing is an analysis of, do we have enough autonomy to operate all these services with this software ourselves? If somebody else's supply chain changes and you're no longer able to receive services or updates or time from employees from another company, then are we still going to be able to provide all these services? And so in many cases, the answer is it's free software and open source software, but it's not just that, because we offer software, but we also offer a very well tested and a very mature legal and technical framework, because right since the beginning, which you could say would be 1983, we've put a lot of work into our licenses and into procedures for how we publish software and how we run our projects. And for this reason, when governments are now looking for software that they can verify and audit the security or the compliance of, and which they can replicate and they can adapt to make interoperability possible, or to apply the standards of your country or your region. Basically, when they say they need to verify and adapt, they're using different words to talk about the same thing that we've been talking about for 40 years. We say free and open source software is software you can use, study and modify, redistribute, and share modifications. So in this sense, digital sovereignty is something that we should see as an opportunity, as a way to explain to governments how they have goals, and what we have done is very similar to their goals, and it would be ideal if they would collaborate with us and work with us on these projects. But at the very least, they should be looking at how we've done this work over the past 40 years, and they should emulate what we have done. So that brings us to the Cyber Resilience Act. So this became very famous because there was never anything like this in the world for software. Software always relied mostly on copyright. Sometimes those work needed on patents or trademarks or company law, but in general it was copyright. The Cyber Resilience Act is completely different. So I'll get into that in the next slide. So the Cyber Resilience Act was proposed in 2022, and it was finally voted on and adopted in 2024. But it's not a finished piece of law because a lot of the details were left for implementation. And so in many ways, it's only half done. The fines that people can get for not complying with the CRA are also not actually applicable yet. That will become applicable in 2027. So we are not currently living in a world where the CRA really exists for companies. So the reason it's a big change is that with copyright, we had a global treaty called the Berne Convention, and then to make our legal framework, we could build our framework on top of this international treaty. And so it was very much an internal project we had. We negotiated what licenses we would accept and how to draft new licenses, and we sometimes disagreed over which licenses were acceptable, but it was always an internal process that we used to create the legal framework for our software. Market regulation is different because market regulation is where a country says, if you want to commercialize your software in our market, you have to do these things first. So in this way, you can say that policy is the new licensing, because people who used to work on licensing, what they were really working on was the legal framework of free and open source software. And while that used to be done by developing our own licenses and our project procedures, it's now going to be done a lot more and more by talking with governments about what laws they're going to create. So the people who were interested in licensing should probably now be interested in policy. So I mentioned that the Cyber Resilience Act is only half done. There are many parts that are still being worked on, but I'll just mention 4 briefly. Voluntary attestation. This is for projects or individuals who do not have any obligations under the Cyber Resilience Act, but would like to make it easier for other people to do compliance with their software. And so they can voluntarily fill in a form and do certain procedures, but the procedures have not been defined yet. So we're defining those at the moment. The second thing is category definitions. That's just that different security levels have different levels of obligations. There are guidance documents, and these are official documents from the European Commission, which explain certain parts of the Cyber Resilience Act. And then there are standards, and standards is taking the most work, but I wanted to explain a little bit about what standards are in policy, because as a software developer in my past, when I thought of standards, I thought of data format standards, video standards, audio format standards. Standards in policy are procedures which you can follow, and if you follow the procedure, then you have a presumption that you have complied with the regulation. And so in the Cyber Resilience Act, it says that you can perform a risk assessment, and after you perform a risk assessment, then you can put your product on the market only if it has no known exploitable vulnerabilities. And so if you want to comply with the Cyber Resilience Act, one way to do that is to make up your own procedure for how you will interpret this piece of text, and then what do you think it means for a vulnerability to be a vulnerability? What does it mean for it to be exploitable? What does it mean for it to be known? Who should it be known to? And how does the risk assessment change all this? So a standard, an EU standard, an official standard, will give a procedure that you can follow, and if you follow that procedure, then you get a presumption that you comply with the text of the Cyber Resilience Act. So while working on the Cyber Resilience Act, I wanted to focus more on our ecosystem, because the Cyber Resilience Act, it's largely a European topic. But I think for an international audience, what's more interesting is the effects that this has on our ecosystem. So the first thing we learned from the Cyber Resilience Act is that in our ecosystem, we've always had developers and translators and designers and we've had lawyers, we've had people working on communications, but the role of policy staff or policy people is really, it's becoming a separate role now, because we're realizing that when the work of talking to governments is done by developers or lawyers or managers, it doesn't happen very smoothly. There are a lot of problems we encounter. And so policy people are people who are familiar with talking to government and who can talk to the developers and the managers and the lawyers, and then be an interface to the policy world and help figure out how to effectively participate in the policy world. So this is the work that I started doing 20 years ago, and there's still not enough people doing it, so I'm still doing this work. So when we do this, one of the things we try to do when we're talking to the governments is, instead of talking about demands, for example, all software must be free and open source software, we try and present what we're proposing as solutions. And so we look for objectives that the government has, and then we say, well, you want to reduce monopolies, or you want to increase competition, or you want to provide high quality jobs. And then we say, well, this is what our software actually does already. So in one sense, we have to make sure that we have more policy people who can do that work. And we also need to hopefully have staff who can do this, because the work of working on policy, it's something you really learn while you're doing it. And so we have some people start getting interested in policy when there's an emergency like the Cyber Resilience Act, and they work on it and they make lots of mistakes in the start because it's not obvious how to do this work. But then by the end of the procedure, they've learned how the Parliament works and how the Commission works and how the procedure works. But then they go back to their real jobs, because they were never meant to be working on a policy file. They saw an emergency and started dealing with it. And so this constant turnover means that we find it difficult to develop a core group of experts who can work on the next emergency when it arises. The second thing we need to think about is international coordination. And so this is really important to prevent the laws in different countries from being completely different and creating a very complex situation. But I'll speak a little more about that at the end. The third thing that is affected by this new volume of work is the role of software foundations. So in the past and currently, software foundations often perform a lot of the administrative details, a lot of the work of collecting copyrights or checking trademark issues, gathering assignments from employers, things like this. And it was a certain amount of work. It doesn't really get all that much appreciation. But if the new situation is that there's a lot of compliance work to be done, and if companies and projects expect the foundation to do this work, then the foundations are going to need a lot more support in doing that work. That's if the foundations were to do it. The other possibility would be that the companies would do this work. And so the two arguments would be, companies would think that having the work centralized makes it more efficient, and therefore doing it at the foundation level makes sense. For foundations, people or projects, people look at the companies and say, well, you're making money off this, I'm not. Why would I do the work? This is really for you to do. And so this is just a new complex dynamic that we have to work on. And it's also made more complex by the fact that it's sometimes easier for the work to be done by projects than by a foundation or by a company. Because when the projects are doing the work, they already have the experts in the software and they know the history and the way in which the software was developed. And so that can be, that makes it easier for them to gather the necessary information for compliance. When companies have to do the work, then they are in a situation that they might be commercializing or distributing a piece of software, but they usually don't employ all the developers of that piece of software. And so they don't have the contractual link that would allow them to tell the developers, we need this information by Thursday, please provide it. And so this is just one of the complex relationships that will change as compliance work becomes larger and larger. So probably the easiest way to get all this compliance work done would be for projects to collaborate, and for companies who are both commercializing a piece of software to collaborate and do the compliance work once rather than do it separately. This is always difficult because then companies are often competing against each other, and so asking competing companies to collaborate sometimes doesn't always get a positive response. But this would be the efficient way to do it. The second problem is that this creates the possibility of free riders, where there could be 3 companies that are commercializing a piece of software, and the first 2 companies might do all the effort to work on compliance, and the third company does nothing but is able to use the compliance information without having paid for it. So this is, on one hand, it's complicated, but on the other hand, it's very similar to previous situations we've had where companies pay for the development of the software and other companies then commercialize. So it's possible the solution will just be that we have to accept that there will be free riders, and we have to think about how to give an advantage to people who do contribute back. That could simply be reputation, or it could be something more complicated. And then the final thing is that in the way we do our work, we have to look at how we use our resources. Now, I called this on the slide, I called it participation fatigue, and I need to find a new word because that's too negative. But the purpose is that when governments started writing new laws about software, we said to them that they should consult us and they should ask for our help and our advice on how to make sure these laws would work correctly with free and open source software. In the European Union, we've been very successful, and the European Commission has been very collaborative or cooperative. And so in a lot of new laws, they have created procedures that allow the free and open source ecosystem to participate. And the problem we now have is that it's quite difficult to participate in all these different procedures and all these different communities and advisory boards and expert groups. And we need to find ways to make this work easier by cooperating with each other and collaborating. We need to increase the number of people doing the work, and we may need to also talk to the governments and find more efficient ways that we can provide the input that they're now asking us for. So this is the list of topics that I'm not going to mention. These are things other than the Cyber Resilience Act, which we're also working on in the European Union. And I guess you'll have also similar things in Korea and other parts of the world as well. But this also gives an idea of the problem of participation fatigue. We don't have the resources to work on all these different topics. And so we have to pick and choose. And sometimes we will then leave an important task not done. And that's unfortunate, and hopefully we can improve in the future. So the second thing is the way we talk to governments. We need to think more about how to be a good partner and how to be somebody that the governments want to talk to. And so this is one aspect is, as I mentioned, we should present free and open source software as a solution rather than additional demand. We also need to explain to them how laws can affect free and open source software differently compared to proprietary software. And so, for example, in the Cyber Resilience Act, there are obligations when you place your software on the market, which is basically when you make it available in a commercial situation. And for proprietary software, which is developed, at least in the old model, was developed in a single company, and then when the product director decides that it's time to make a release, they can make a release. They have a very simple situation. They have a limited number of releases that happen when they decide, and they have an employment contract with all the developers. For a free and open source project, you often have multiple companies that are commercializing the same software package. And so this is complicated then because they don't have the same commercial or employment contract with the developers. And there's also more of a tradition of frequent releases. We often have projects that even do daily releases. And when multiple companies are competing to commercialize the same piece of software, they are encouraged to get new features onto the market as quickly as possible, rather than waiting for a moment, which is part of their strategy. So we tend to have a lot more releases. We tend to have development shared between different companies, and we also have a lot of the work is done by people who are not directly benefiting from the commercialization. And so you have a lot of software that's developed by, well, you have a small amount of software developed by people who are not paid, but you have a large amount of software that is developed by people who are paid, but their paid job is not to produce software. Their paid job might be to keep a network running or to make this new toy function. That's their actual paid job. And then as part of that job, they will use a tool and they might contribute to that tool. And so they, on one hand, they are a commercial developer, but they also don't receive any direct benefit from anyone who's selling the software. So in this sense, this is something that people writing legislation don't understand, because that's free and open source software to them is the new thing, and we have to help them understand the new thing. The third issue is that with the growth of free and open source software, we now have a situation where some governments may be looking at the number of companies that are popping up, and they may see a commercial interest in trying to find a way to monetize all this software that's being used. And so in the past, we had problems with companies who owned patents would say that they own a patent on that software. And this problem has been greatly reduced over time, but there's always the worry that this will come back, and that countries may see that their patent holders are not being paid for their patents, and that other people are profiting from this software. And so to prevent bad policy with that motivation, we need to talk to governments and explain to them how they benefit more from being able to use free and open source software than they would by trying to profit from it. And so the final thing that I would mention is when we communicate with the governments, we need to have a unified position, and this is something we've never really had in our ecosystem. We've always had a very diverse ecosystem with different projects and different foundations, and even different language environments, and there was never a need or a possibility to have a unified voice for all these projects. The closest situation we had was trying to collectively write a software license, and even then it was never for all the projects, it was for a set of projects. But the reason this is important is because there was a recent event where somebody from the European Commission said that open source is a black box. And what they were explaining with this is that if two groups come to them and one group says, we are a free and open source software company, we say you should do this, and another company says, well, we are also a free and open source software company, and we say you should do something else. Because free and open source software is so new to the government, they can't see inside our ecosystem. They can't see which of these two companies or these two associations or projects, they can't see which one represents a large group or which one represents a small group, or they can't see which one is a real valuable member of the community and which one is just a free rider. All these things that we might see as quite obvious, for them it's a black box. So we will never get rid of the diverse voices within the community at the project level, but at some point we do have to be able to talk to the governments with a unified voice. And so, when we try to do this, people sometimes get worried about, like, how do we choose who the voice is, or what do you do when there's a dispute? In theory, that would be a problem, but I can say that in the last 3 years, while working on the Cyber Resilience Act, we had 3 times where there were disagreements between, fundamental disagreements between parts of the ecosystem or the group of people who were working on this, and all 3 times the problem went away, either because simply by talking to each other, we can find a different option which doesn't require harming either party, or in one instance we took too long to make a decision and time ran out. But so sometimes it works out well and sometimes it works out not so well, but it never creates a rift. It never turns into two factions that will never talk to each other and refuse to work together. We've always found a way to get all the different positions to work together on something that they can all support. Maybe this is also one of the reasons why we need policy people, because this is something that they're good at. And then the fourth point I want to make, and I just want to check the time, we're good, is, oh no. So the last point is the complicated situation of how to prevent different countries from having different pieces of legislation that make life difficult for developers. So the worst case scenario would be if we had the Cyber Resilience Act creating 10 obligations in Europe, and then some other law in Korea creating 10 obligations, and another law in the US and Japan and China and Canada. And the worst case scenario would just be the number of obligations would increase and increase. If that happens, then projects are going to start making decisions. They're going to say, well, I can't do all that work to comply with all these different laws. I'm only commercializing my software in Europe anyway, so I'll only do the European part. And then you might have another company that says, well, I'm only commercializing in Asia and North America, so I'll only do the compliance there. And so this creates one problem, that you then have software that isn't available in other parts of the world. And it also creates the problem that if these two projects wanted to be combined, if a company wanted to use both projects in their commercial product, there would be no way to distribute it anywhere in the world, because for half of the project you can only distribute in Europe, and for the other half you can only distribute in Asia and North America. So this would be the worst case scenario. The strategies to avoid that, the easiest strategy, or the strategy that would completely avoid the problem, would either be if nobody else made any laws, or if everyone made a law that's the same as the Cyber Resilience Act. Now, that's a difficult thing to ask, because governments in general don't like being told to copy what some other government has done. And so then we have to find different ways to achieve the same result. So one possibility would be that we talk to governments about implementing some parts of the Cyber Resilience Act. And if they did this, if other countries had a subset of what's in the Cyber Resilience Act, then once you do Cyber Resilience Act compliance, you would automatically cover what's in those other laws as well. So if we do this, maybe the most friendly way to explain it, or to promote this idea, would be take the good, leave the bad. Maybe governments would find that acceptable, and we'll have to try. A second possibility would be that in the Cyber Resilience Act there is a clause that says that the European Commission can sign a mutual recognition agreement with other countries. And if we do this, then that would mean that if Korea had its own procedure, then the European Union could say, well, if somebody complies with your procedure, we'll accept that in the European Union. And if somebody complies with our procedure, you accept that in Korea. So that would be one way of doing that. It's a lot of work. These treaties, they are international treaties, and they have to be negotiated at a very high level. They sometimes also require that in the other country you must have an office that's able to verify that that other country is complying with their own legislation. So it's not a simple solution, but it's none of these solutions are simple. So it's on the table. I'll jump to the fourth point then. The fourth one would be to build on international standards. And so this is something that I believe the Korean government is interested in. And so I will be trying to talk to people about this in the coming days. And so the idea would be that if there are international, for example, ISO standards on cybersecurity, then people could use those standards, and this would be one way to get the result of everyone having a similar compatible law. So those are the three procedural ways of achieving compatibility. none of them are easy, but the alternative is the worst case scenario where we have a lot more compliance work to do and a lot of companies not being able to commercialize the software. So then within these, there's the third bullet point, making the CRA a success, is a bit of a meta point. So sometimes when we get new laws, when the new laws are imposed on us, it feels like something that we didn't ask for, and therefore something that we don't really want to work on the compliance. And so we might look for the minimal, the smallest way to work on compliance. The benefit of doing the least work possible is that it's less work. So if we took that approach, then we'd look at the CRA and we'd say, well, what's the smallest amount of work we can do that ticks all the boxes, and then we can say, okay, it's CRA compliant. We don't have a problem anymore. However, it might be a better strategy if we do a little bit more than the least possible. If we try and make the compliance procedures actually useful, if we focus on improving cybersecurity in our compliance procedures, then one benefit is that we get improved cybersecurity in our products, in our software projects as well, which is always nice and is something that probably should be happening anyway. A second benefit is that we might avoid further regulation, because if the European Commission sees that everyone is complying with the CRA, but cybersecurity didn't really get improved, there's probably a temptation then to say, I think we need more regulation. And so if we want to avoid that, then it would be much better if we enthusiastically comply and make sure the CRA is a success. And so everyone can say, okay, cybersecurity is now a solved problem. And then the third reason why making the CRA a success is important is because if we are going to go to other countries in the world and suggest that they make regulation that's similar to the CRA, it'll be a lot easier if we can say the CRA has been implemented in the EU, it has greatly increased cybersecurity, and we have all these examples. And so if we can make CRA look like it was very effective, then it'll be a lot easier for other countries to adopt something similar. And that will avoid the situation where we have more compliance work for our projects. With that, the work that we're doing in Europe is, we sometimes concentrate on how much work we're not able to do, but we also have to look at the successes. We did, in a 3-year period, we got very organized. A lot of companies and associations and individuals got active and did a lot of great work, and that community has it's stayed together, and real groups are forming to work not just on the Cyber Resilience Act, but also the AI Act and hopefully other pieces of law outside of the European Union. One group that we set up is called the Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group. And so this is where it's an Eclipse hosted group, but it's not run by Eclipse. It's Eclipse hosted in the sense that we provide the infrastructure and most of the funding for the work of the Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group. But the subgroups within this entity are run by people from other organizations. So that's where we do most of the work to develop the Cyber Resilience Act compliance at the moment. And then as time goes on, this is also where compliance with things like the AI Act and possibly laws outside the European Union will be worked on as well. I will come back to the QR code yes, this is the end. And so with that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.